So that's all I have for performance and handling. Let's move to the design and the features. Yeah, so that's really one thing I really like about this Vespa. I mean, it's a Vespa after all, right? So it has that iconic design, and of course that's a subjective thing. Not everybody would like the Vespa's design, but I definitely do. It's a modern Vespa. It's not quite like the old classics, but I think it does carry enough of that that spirit, you know, from the old Vespas to really feel like one, to really feel like a Vespa. Of course, those are all geared, and you had the rear brake at the right foot, like on a motorcycle. And those were two-stroke, and the engine was to one side, to the right side. So the scooters were always a little unbalanced. This does not have those issues. In fact, you know, I even think that the engine sounds a bit like the classic Vespas, a bit. Not the very old ones, but if you consider the PX models where the two-stroke sound was a little softer, I think this one, when it idles or when it's at low revs, it, you know, the throbbing of the engine, it does remind you of those Vespa PX models. So I think Piaggio has put in a good effort to maintain the spirit of, you know, the Vespas, even in these modern ones. So one unique aspect of the Vespa design is the steel monocoque chassis. Now it may not be completely unique, but it's kind of rare amongst the smaller modern scooters. And so, you know, unlike most other scooters that have a steel tubular frame and plastic panels that attach around it to make up the body, on a Vespa a lot of the parts are actually part of the chassis itself, and there is no tubular frame in a lot of the areas. Let me stop and show you what I mean. So that side stand, by the way, guys, that's not standard fitment. It's original Vespa accessory, but you don't get it as part of the bike. So yeah, so if you see, this is the storage compartment which can be lifted out. And if you see underneath that, that's the engine, and this part, you know, the sides, that's the chassis. The body itself, that's the chassis, and there is no frame inside. And that's the fuel tank, the battery box. And one thing I don't like about this, you know, you have to take the key off the ignition to open up the seat. A lot of the other modern scooters, you can just push some button here to release the seat. So these panels here, this whole thing, that's metal, and that's part of the frame. So yeah, that's a bit of a unique thing about Vespas, and that contributes to the look. But it's both a good and a bad thing, you know. It's good that it's metal, and you know, I'm not sure. I mean, you can probably achieve the same look with plastic panels as well. I'm not sure, but the bad thing is if that gets damaged significantly, you can't replace it because that's the frame itself. So any damage to those parts which can't be repaired means that your scooter is totaled. But other than that, that part is metal, part of the chassis. Also this front, I don't know what it's called. It's not a fairing, it's whatever, you know, the front panel. That's metal on the outside, but on the inside, this storage area which you see, that's plastic. Also the panels on the handlebars, these are plastic, but it's really good plastic, you know, as in you can't really tell just by looking which parts are plastic and which are metal. They blend in so well that you can't tell. So if you ask for my take on that part of it, yeah, I really do like it. I think it contributes to that Vespa look, and the way they have integrated the plastic parts and the metal chassis, you know, it's done really well. I mean, if you think about the classic Vespas, everything was metal, even the handlebar components. But on these they are plastic, but they have kind of tried to achieve that old look without doing everything in metal, which would make it heavy and also possibly a little more you know, complicated to manufacture. So is everything great about the design? Are there no flaws? Of course there are. There are quite a few flaws actually, which I don't like. One, I talked about the key thing. There are two keyholes, a separate one for the seat. Most modern Japanese or even Indian brands like TVS, they have a single button at the front near the keyhole. Or the key itself, you know, has to be turned or pushed in a certain way to release the seat lock. Quite windy today, kind of pushing me around. So another problem is with the fuel filler neck. It's really narrow, so it's really narrow, and when you put the nozzle in, you can't see how much is filled. Now I think that's kind of normal for a lot of cars and modern bikes, and the filler itself is supposed to cut off automatically once the right level is reached, but somehow on this, when it does cut off, it's still quite low, and you can fill up quite a little more without you know, completely filling it up to the brim. So when the pump attendants here in India, when they do that, quite often they splash some fuel outside the tank, and that splashes onto the area around that filler cap and the part of the body at the back there. And that's very, very common. Almost every other refueling ends up in some fuel splashing out. And now maybe that's something that if you are aware of, and if you do it yourself, you'll be careful enough and you'd be able to avoid it. But the problem is here, you can't in India you can't fill the fuel yourself. It has to be done by an attendant, and many of them are not aware of this. I often try to tell them to be careful, and sometimes they listen, and sometimes they even are aware of this, so they are careful themselves, but most often they are not, and it ends up in some fuel splashing out, and I have to clean that up. And I mean, we all know that that happening repeatedly it's not good for your paint, right? Also the mirrors, they're not that great, and the field of view itself is kind of average. It's not that wide, but not too narrow as well. But the range of motion, you know, that's kind of too restricted. I mean, I can't turn them inwards enough to get the kind of view that I would like. Yeah, maybe I would be able to move the arms themselves a little inwards, and that would probably solve that problem. But you know, as it is on a small scooter, the handlebars are kind of close to you, and if I move those mirrors more inwards, I mean the arms themselves, that would make them even closer, so that would really turn my head to, you know, look at the mirrors, and that's not right. So with the position of the mirrors the way they are now, I'm okay with them, but there should have been a little more range of motion, you know, so that I could adjust them just right. And the storage on the front, they call this a glove box. It's good, it's better than not having anything, but it's not that practical because the space inside is quite limited. It's you really can't store a lot of things there, and also it looks like one big box, but in the center there is that the steering column, you know, so that takes up space, so you kind of have two small cubby holes on either side, which are covered by that single lid. So design wise, those are the things. If you talk about build quality, Vespas are supposed to be top-notch quality, and for the most part it is. I couldn't find that many flaws, you know, in terms of the build quality, but there are a few flaws. You know, when I got the bike, one of the rear turn signal lenses, you know, where the screw goes in, I could see parts of some dead insect which was kind of sandwiched between the lens, the plastic lens, and the body. And I found that really odd, but I was like, okay, yes, you know, probably didn't have such a clean atmosphere at the factory. Somehow some insect sneaked in and then got stuck in there, and nobody noticed. So that was that. Not a big deal. But sometime later I was cleaning the scooter, and that very same part of the turn signal lens, it cracked, and some bits of it broke off. The lens is still attached. It hasn't broken enough to, you know, completely detach the lens. So I'll probably show you a separate clip of how bad that is. It's not that bad, but it happened. I'm not sure if that insect was responsible for that, or if the screw was just tightened too much. But yeah, I don't know. That's not a good thing, right? So that was the only quality issue that I found. Other than that, it's been quite good. Since it's a carbureted engine with a choke, do I have starting trouble? Usually not. I mean, of course, it's not as easy as starting a fuel-injected engine. So you have to use a choke and also give it a bit of throttle as you crank the engine. And you need to get the right combination of choke and throttle to get it started most days. So it often doesn't start on the first go because, you know, I don't like to give it a lot of throttle. I don't want to rev the engine when it's cold. So I just try to give it a little throttle and about half choke, because full choke is often a little too much when you're starting, because it doesn't get that cold here. So yeah, if I don't get that combination right with the throttle and the choke, it doesn't start. And then after 2 or 3 tries, it starts. So yeah, that's not a big deal. I think it's kind of common for carbureted engines. When it's warm, yeah, you just crank the engine with little throttle and it'll start up. No choke necessary. So it still hasn't done much distance, but over time I know that carburetors can need some maintenance in terms of cleaning and tuning. So when that time comes, I'm not sure how it will be, because I myself am not very experienced with carburetors. So yeah, I may have to learn it up or depend on the dealer to do it. So how has my experience been with the dealer? It's been mixed. I don't have any issues with their attitude. That's been good for the most part. The sales experience was quite good, and even the service experience wasn't bad at all. Except that, you know, it's a common attitude in India for the non-enthusiast class of vehicles, you know, the smaller bikes and scooters, which are often used as commuter machines. And even for the average car dealers, they just assume that the customer doesn't know much about the technicalities of the vehicle, so they just want to take you for a ride, you know. So one particular instance that I experienced was I had given my scooter for a regular service that involved an oil change, but what they did is, without even asking me, while filling the new oil, they also added some oil additive, which was separate from the oil, and that was charged extra. And I mean, I noticed it much later when I was scanning the invoice. I didn't expect anything like that to happen. I mean, it was just a regular oil change, right? And then I see that additive there, and as it was already quite late, I didn't want to talk to them about it, you know. It's kind of common practice here unless you're really careful. I mean, you should not need an additive right? It's optional. If the customer asks for it, or if you want to put it in, you need to ask the customer and do it with his consent, right? Not just put it in and bill him for it and not even tell him about it. That's not the right way to do it. So that's the only gripe I have. I mean, it's not just that instant, it's that attitude that it's okay for them to do it and get away with it, you know. So since then I haven't gone to the dealership for any of the services. The next oil change is coming up. As usual, you know, with my motorcycles, I plan to do it myself from here on. It shouldn't be that difficult. I'll update you when I get it done, you know, so you get an idea. So that's my dealership experience. For most people who are not much into the technicalities of the vehicles, it should be a good experience. They are courteous. Whoa, what was that? I just got some splash of water from I don't know where. So the dealers are courteous, well behaved. They appear friendly enough to the customer. Much better than the Royal Enfield dealers for sure, from my experience. So we're good enough. Just be careful about such practices.